The rumble of a meticulously maintained 1967 Mustang echoed through the tree-lined streets of Arlington's most prestigious neighborhood. General Michael Torres guided the classic car, its deep burgundy paint catching the golden hues of the setting sun, toward his colonial-style home on Oakwood Drive. The leather steering wheel felt cool beneath his weathered hands, a small comfort after 14 grueling hours at the Pentagon coordinating international defense strategies with allies across 3 continents. The day had been particularly challenging. A developing situation in the South China Sea had demanded his attention since dawn, followed by back-to-back meetings with the Joint Chiefs. Now, at 7:45 p.m., he looked forward to a quiet dinner with his family, assuming his teenage daughters, Maya and Sophia, hadn't already raided the lasagna his wife Maria had promised to make. As he pulled into his circular driveway, the motion sensor lights illuminated the meticulous landscaping Maria took such pride in. The white hydrangeas were in full bloom, their full heads nodding gently in the evening breeze. His neighbors, the Andersons, waved from their evening walk with their golden retriever, Max. This was the peace he cherished after days filled with global security concerns and military strategies. Torres switched off the engine, savoring the last notes of Miles Davis floating from the car's carefully upgraded sound system. He'd restored the Mustang himself over 3 years, a project that had helped him decompress after his last deployment. Every weekend spent under the hood had been a meditation, a way to process the weight of command and responsibility he carried. Stepping out of the car, he breathed in the crisp spring air. His polo shirt and jeans felt wonderfully casual after a day in full dress uniform. He changed before leaving the Pentagon, knowing he'd promised Maya help with her calculus homework. At 17, she was already talking about West Point, following in his footsteps, though Maria hoped she might consider Georgetown instead. The general reached into the back seat for his worn leather briefcase, still stuffed with classified documents that would need reviewing before tomorrow's 600 briefing. The folder marked Urgent contained satellite imagery he'd need to analyze, but that could wait until after family time. In 29 years of military service, he learned the hard way that you couldn't get back missed moments with loved ones. As he closed the car door, Torres noticed a patrol car slowing at the end of his driveway. This wasn't unusual in itself. The neighborhood had excellent police presence, one of the reasons he and Maria had chosen it when they moved from Fort Bragg 6 years ago. But something about the way the car lingered, then made a sudden U-turn, set off the finely tuned instincts he'd developed over decades of military service. The patrol car's headlights swept across his property as it pulled up, positioning itself at an angle that blocked the driveway. Torres stood calmly beside his Mustang, house keys in one hand, briefcase in the other. Through the darkening evening, he could make out a single officer inside, young, probably new to the force based on how he gripped the steering wheel. Light spilled from the front windows of his home, and he could see Sophia practicing her violin in the living room, her silhouette moving with the music he couldn't quite hear. Maria appeared briefly in the window, probably heading to the kitchen to check on dinner. Neither had noticed the patrol car yet, and Torres preferred to keep it that way. Whatever was about to unfold, he would handle it with the same calm precision he brought to every challenge in his distinguished career. The patrol car's door opened, and Officer Ryan Collins emerged, his hand resting near his holster in a way that spoke volumes about his preconceptions. Torres took a deep breath, setting his briefcase down slowly beside the Mustang's front tire. In his mind, he could hear his father's voice from 30 years ago. No matter what happens, son, carry yourself with dignity. Your actions speak louder than any words ever could. Officer Ryan Collins stepped out of his patrol car, leaving the blue and red lights off, but keeping his high beams trained on the Mustang. At 26, he was 4 months into his job at the Arlington Police Department, transferred from a small town in Nebraska. The prestigious neighborhood made him nervous. Every shift felt like a test he couldn't afford to fail. "Sir, place your hands where I can see them," Collins called out, his voice carrying a slight tremor he hoped the older man wouldn't notice. The beam of his tactical flashlight swept across Torres' face, then down to his hands, which were already held loosely at chest level. Torres maintained his composed stance, noting how the young officer's weight shifted from foot to foot. "Good evening, officer," he said, his voice carrying the natural authority of someone used to commanding rooms full of generals. "I'm standing in my driveway. Is there something I can help you with?" Collins advanced, maintaining what he considered a safe distance. The man's calm demeanor unsettled him. It didn't match what his training sergeant back in Nebraska had described. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area," he said, though no such reports existed. "I'm going to need to see some identification." Behind Torres, Sophia's violin practice continued, Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata floating through the evening air. A neighbor's sprinkler system clicked on, its gentle rhythm contrasting with the tense scenario unfolding on the driveway. The general's eyes flickered to his briefcase, knowing his military ID was inside. "My identification is in my briefcase, Officer Collins," Torres said, reading the nameplate on the officer's uniform. "I'm going to reach down very slowly to retrieve it. The briefcase contains classified military documents, so I'll need to be careful how I open it." Military documents. Collins' hand tightened on his flashlight. "Sir, step away from the briefcase. How did you come to possess classified materials?" A smile touched the corners of Torres' mouth, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm General Michael Torres, currently serving as Deputy Joint Chief of Operations at the Pentagon. This is my home, and I'm returning from work." He gestured toward the house number clearly displayed on the Colonial's front pillar. "You can verify this information with your dispatcher." Collins hesitated. The man's bearing and speech patterns didn't fit his preconceptions, but 4 months on the job had taught him to be suspicious of everyone's stories. "Remain still, sir. I'm calling this in." He reached for his radio, eyes never leaving Torres. The general stood perfectly still, decades of military discipline evident in his posture. Through the front window, he could see Maria approaching, her expression changing as she noticed the scene in their driveway. He gave a subtle shake of his head, and she understood, stepping back into the shadows of their living room. "Dispatch, this is Unit 247. Collins spoke into his radio, his voice cracking slightly. "I've got a subject claiming to be military personnel in possession of classified documents, requesting verification and backup at 4287 Oakwood Drive." As the radio crackled with acknowledgement, motion at the neighboring house caught Torres' attention. Elizabeth Montgomery, their neighbor and a Supreme Court clerk, had emerged onto her porch. Her phone was held discreetly at her side, its camera lens catching the scene. Behind her, her husband Thomas, a retired Navy SEAL, stood in the doorway, his expression grim. The evening air grew heavier with tension as Collins maintained his position, flashlight beam unwavering. Torres could read the internal struggle on the young officer's face. Training versus instinct, fear versus uncertainty. In the distance, sirens began their distinctive wail. "Officer Collins," Torres said softly, his tone the same one he used to mentor young officers of the Pentagon, "I understand you're doing your job. But right now, you're about to make a decision that will affect both our lives. I suggest we both take a breath and handle this professionally." Elizabeth Montgomery's fingers moved swiftly across her phone screen, sending a group text to neighbors she knew would want to witness this unfolding situation. As a Supreme Court clerk who had worked on numerous civil rights cases, she recognized the significance of what was happening. Her husband Thomas, the former Navy SEAL, had already slipped around the side of their house, positioning himself where he could intervene if needed. The evening air carried the sound of more doors opening along Oakwood Drive. Down the street, retired Captain James Wheeler dropped his evening jog entirely, his military training kicking in as he assessed the scene. He had served under General Torres during Operation Desert Shield, and the sight of his former commander being detained made his blood run cold. "Officer," Wheeler called out, maintaining a safe distance as he approached, "I can vouch for this man's identity. That's General Torres, Deputy Joint Chief of Operations." Collins' flashlight beam swung briefly toward Wheeler before returning to Torres. "Sir, stay back. This is an active police matter." His voice carried the strain of someone realizing they might be in over their head. More neighbors emerged onto their perfectly manicured lawns. The Paddles, both prominent surgeons, stood on their front steps recording. Robert Chen, a technology executive who had worked with the Pentagon on cybersecurity, recognized Torres immediately from their monthly briefings. The growing crowd of witnesses added to the tension crackling in the air. Inside the Torres home, Sophia had stopped playing her violin, the abrupt silence more noticeable than the music had been. Maria stood at the window, her phone pressed to her ear, speaking quietly with her sister, a civil rights attorney in Boston. Maya, their older daughter, had come downstairs and now stood frozen in the foyer, watching her father maintain his dignified stance in the face of this situation. Dispatched to Unit 247, the radio crackled, making Collins jump slightly. Be advised, residence is registered to General Michael Torres, U.S. Army. Credentials are being verified with Pentagon Security Office. Lieutenant Martinez is en route to your location. Torres hadn't moved, his hand still visible as neighbors' phones captured every moment. Elizabeth Montgomery had moved to the edge of her property, close enough now to clearly document the interaction. Her years of legal experience told her this footage might become important. "You know," Torres spoke calmly, his voice carrying across the now silent street, "I helped design the current training protocols for military police cooperation in crisis situations. Officer Collins, you're doing everything by the book, but sometimes the book needs context." Captain Wheeler had inched closer, his presence a reminder of the military community's strength. Other neighbors had begun quietly introducing themselves to each other, forming small clusters of concerned citizens. The Andersons, who had been walking their dog earlier, now stood with the Paddles, explaining how Torres had helped their son prepare for his Naval Academy interview. The sound of approaching sirens grew louder. Red and blue lights began to paint the elegant homes in alternating colors. Lieutenant Carmen Martinez's unmarked car turned onto Oakwood Drive, followed by 2 patrol units. She took in the scene quickly, the distinguished general, the nervous rookie officer, and at least 15 neighbors recording every moment on their phones. Torres focused on Collins, seeing the growing uncertainty in the young officer's eyes. "Your backup is almost here," he said softly. "When this is over, I'd like to talk with you about your career goals. I think you have potential, but you need to learn to see the whole picture, not just the frame you're given." The general's words, spoken with genuine interest rather than anger, seemed to hit Collins harder than any reprimand could have. The young officer's flashlight beam wavered, then lowered slightly as Lieutenant Martinez's car door opened. In the distance, a news van turned onto Oakwood Drive, its satellite dish visible above the trees. The quiet neighborhood had become an accidental stage for a drama that would soon capture national attention. Lieutenant Martinez strode toward the scene, her 20 years of experience evident in every step. The news van's lights clicked on, bathing the driveway in an artificial glow that made everything feel suddenly theatrical. She noted the growing crowd, the phones recording, and most importantly, the calm dignity of the man her rookie officer was detaining. "General Torres," she said, her voice carrying clear recognition, "I apologize for this situation. Officer Collins, lower your flashlight." She turned to Collins, whose complexion had gone from flushed to pale as realization began to dawn. "Sir," Torres addressed Collins directly, "I'm going to reach for my briefcase now." His movements were deliberate as he lifted the worn leather case. The brass combination locks clicked open, and he carefully extracted his military ID, along with a folder bearing the Pentagon seal. Collins' hands trembled slightly as he accepted the credentials. The holographic security features caught the light, and 4 silver stars gleamed from the general's ID photo. The young officer's eyes widened as he read the security clearance level, higher than anything he'd seen in his training materials. I don't," Collins started, but Torres cut him off with a gentle raise of his hand. "At ease, officer," Torres said, using the same tone he used to mentor countless young soldiers. "Let's make this a learning moment." He turned to Lieutenant Martinez. "Carmen, I remember when you were a rookie too. Remember that training session we did at the academy 10 years ago?" Martinez nodded, a small smile playing her lips. The one where you taught us about perspective and judgment? I still use those lessons with my officers. She placed a steadying hand on Colin's shoulder, feeling the tension in the young officer's frame. The news crew had begun setting up their equipment, but Torres shook his head at them, gesturing for them to wait. This moment wasn't for public consumption. It was about something more important than headlines. Officer Collins, Torres said, "Look at this folder." He held up the classified document sleeve. Inside are satellite images showing potential threats to our nation. I review these every night because lives depend on making the right calls, just like your job requires you to make judgment calls. The difference is in how we gather information before making those decisions. Collins swallowed hard, his police academy training warring with the reality before him. Captain Wheeler had moved closer, and now Torres gestured for him to join them. "James," Torres addressed his former subordinate, "tell Officer Collins about that night in Kuwait when we had to make a split-second decision about an approaching vehicle." Wheeler nodded, understanding the general's intent. "We had all the signs of a potential threat, sir, but you made us wait those extra crucial seconds to verify. Saved a family of 5 who were just lost and scared." The gathering crowd had fallen silent, watching the impromptu teaching moment. Maria Torres had finally emerged from the house, carrying a tray with glasses of water. She handed them out to the officers with a grace that spoke of years hosting military functions. "Ryan," Torres said, using the officer's first name for the first time, "your instincts to investigate unusual situations are good, but true strength comes from how we handle our moments of uncertainty. What would you have done differently tonight, knowing what you know now?" Collins looked at his lieutenant, then back at Torres, his voice steady for the first time that evening. "I would have called for verification first, sir, and I would have approached with less presumption." Torres nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. The news crew had lowered their camera, sensing that this wasn't the explosive confrontation they'd hoped to film. Instead, they were witnessing something rarer, a moment of genuine understanding and growth. "Lieutenant Martinez," Torres said, "with your permission, I'd like to invite Officer Collins to shadow me at the Pentagon for a day. I think there's a lot we could learn from each other." The morning sun had barely risen over Washington, D.C. when the first news segment aired. Instead of the confrontational footage the networks expected, they found themselves sharing a different kind of story. The videos from neighbors' phones showed something rare, a moment of tension transformed into understanding. "Breaking news this morning," announced Catherine Reynolds on National Morning Report. What could have been another tragic headline instead became an extraordinary example of leadership and learning. The screen split to show carefully selected clips from the previous night, focusing on the dignified interaction between Torres and Collins. In the Pentagon's bustling corridors, General Torres arrived at his usual early hour, his restored Mustang drawing more attention than usual in the parking lot. Junior officers and civilian staff members paused their conversations as he passed, many having already seen the viral videos. His inbox overflowed with messages from military leaders worldwide, each noting how his handling of the situation reflected the highest traditions of military leadership. "Michael," called out Admiral Richardson, falling into step beside Torres. "They're saying your video has hit 5 million views. The Joint Chiefs want to incorporate it into our new civilian-military relations program." Torres continued walking, nodding to saluting personnel. "James, how many times have we trained young officers to handle unexpected situations? This was just another teaching moment, but with a different uniform involved." In the Arlington Police Department, Officer Ryan Collins sat in Lieutenant Martinez's office, watching the media coverage spread across multiple screens. His phone hadn't stopped buzzing since dawn. Messages from former academy classmates, family members, and fellow officers around the country. "The thing is," Collins said, watching a clip of Torres explaining military decision-making protocols to him, "he never made me feel small. He saw it as a chance to build a bridge, not burn one." Martinez smiled, sliding a folder across her desk. The general called this morning. He's serious about that shadowing opportunity at the Pentagon. It's a new program he's creating. Law enforcement and military leadership exchange. Across town, Elizabeth Montgomery presented the previous night's footage during her Supreme Court clerk meeting. Look at the body language transformation, she pointed out. The moment when authority shifts to mutual respect. This is what we've been discussing in our police reform briefs. The story continued to spread throughout the morning. Military bases across the country incorporated the incident into their daily briefings. Police academies requested copies for training purposes. Social media exploded with clips, most focusing on Torres' patient mentoring and Collins' willingness to learn. Maria Torres watched the coverage from her home office, fielding calls from military family support groups. Michael's always been a teacher at heart, she explained to a parent's organization planning to honor him. Even at home, he turns every challenge into a lesson for our girls. By afternoon, the Pentagon's Public Affairs Office had received speaking requests from dozens of organizations. Universities wanted Torres for commencement speeches. Police departments requested training seminars. Civil rights groups praised his approach to turning confrontation into conversation. In a small diner near the police station, Collins sat with his fellow officers during their lunch break. The TV above the counter played yet another news segment about the incident. You know what stuck with me? Collins said to his colleagues, when he showed me those satellite photos. Here's a man who makes decisions affecting global security, and he took the time to help me understand my own biases. That's real leadership. Back at the Pentagon, Torres reviewed the draft of a new training program inspired by the previous night's events. His aide had already scheduled meetings with police departments across the country. The working title read, Building Bridges, Understanding and Growth Across Uniformed Services. Sir, his aide said, entering with another stack of media requests, CNN is asking about your plans to expand the program. Torres looked up from his desk, the same calm expression from the previous night still present. Tell them this isn't about me or Officer Collins anymore. It's about what happens when we choose to learn from each other instead of letting assumptions guide us. The Pentagon's imposing structure cast long shadows across the parking lot as Officer Ryan Collins pulled in, his police cruiser looking distinctly out of place among the military vehicles. At the security checkpoint, a Marine sergeant examined his newly issued credentials with a knowing smile. The story had made rounds through every branch of service. Officer Collins, General Torres greeted him at the entrance, extending his hand. Ready to see how we handle complex decisions at the strategic level. The general wore his full-dress uniform today, 4 silver stars catching the morning light. Collins noticed how every passing service member snapped to attention. Yet Torres acknowledged each with the same respect he'd shown on that evening in his driveway. Inside the command center, wall-mounted screens displayed global operations in real time. Torres led Collins to a briefing room where senior military officers gathered for the morning intelligence update. Gentlemen, Torres announced, Officer Collins will be observing today. He's here to help us build better understanding between our services. The briefing covered potential threats, resource allocation, and strategic responses. Collins watched Torres guide the discussion, noting how he encouraged input from junior officers and challenged assumptions with probing questions. It reminded him of their interaction that night, the same patient approach to gathering information before making decisions. See that map? Torres pointed to a display showing troop movements. Every marker represents lives under our protection. One hasty decision here could affect thousands. That's why we triple verify our intelligence, challenge our own assumptions, and always consider the human element. During lunch in Torres' office, they discussed Collins' background. The young officer spoke about growing up in Nebraska, his father's small farm, and his dream of making a difference in law enforcement. Torres listened intently, occasionally sharing parallel experiences from his own journey through the ranks. Your instinct to protect and serve is admirable, Torres said, gesturing to a wall of photos showing his humanitarian missions. But protection comes in many forms. Sometimes it's about preventing situations from escalating. Other times, it's about building trust before a crisis occurs. The afternoon brought a surprise as Torres took Collins to the Pentagon's Simulation Center. Here, military personnel trained in scenario-based exercises, making split-second decisions under pressure. Torres had arranged for Collins to participate in a joint military-police coordination exercise. This simulation, Torres explained, recreates a situation where military and local law enforcement must work together during a natural disaster. Watch how communication and respect between services saves lives. As they ran through the exercise, Collins found himself working alongside military officers, each bringing different perspectives to the challenge. The scenario forced them to question assumptions, share information, and trust each other's judgment, exactly what hadn't happened that night in the driveway. Later, in Torres' office, they reviewed body camera footage from various police departments, analyzing how different approaches led to different outcomes. Torres had invited Lieutenant Martinez to join them virtually, adding her expertise to the discussion. The key, Torres explained, pointing to a successful de-escalation scenario, is remembering that behind every uniform, military or police, there's a person trying to do what's right. Our job is to help each other make better decisions in difficult moments. As the day drew to a close, Collins stood at the Pentagon's entrance, processing everything he'd learned. The setting sun painted the sky in colors reminiscent of that evening that had changed his perspective forever. "Officer Collins," Torres said, handing him a folder, "these are invitation letters for your entire precinct. Next month, we're launching a joint training initiative. Your experience will be valuable in helping us design it. Sometimes, the best lessons come from our most challenging moments." Collins accepted the folder, noting how different he felt from the nervous rookie who had pulled up to Torres' house just days ago. "General," he replied, "thank you for seeing potential where others might have seen only confrontation." Torres smiled, the same calm expression that had diffused their first encounter. "Ryan, we're building something important here. It's not just about you and me anymore. It's about showing others there's always a better way forward." 1 month after the driveway incident, the Arlington Police Department's training facility buzzed with unusual activity. General Torres stood before a mixed audience of police officers and military personnel, his presentation screen showing the title, "Building Trust Through Understanding: The Bridge Initiative." Officer Collins, now wearing a newly earned training coordinator badge, helped distribute materials to the attendees. His fellow officers noticed the change in him. Gone was the nervous rookie, replaced by someone who carried himself with measured confidence. Leadership, Torres began, isn't about authority, it's about understanding. He clicked to a slide showing his own driveway. This moment could have gone very differently. Instead, it became the foundation for something transformative. The program they developed was unlike traditional training. Mixed teams of police officers and military personnel worked through real-world scenarios, each bringing their unique perspectives. In one exercise, a police sergeant and a Marine lieutenant had to coordinate during a simulated natural disaster, learning to merge their different command structures. "Watch their approach," Collins pointed out during the exercise debrief. "See how they took time to understand each other's protocols. That's what the general taught me that night. The importance of gathering information before making assumptions." During lunch breaks, the groups didn't separate by uniform. Marines sat with patrol officers, sharing stories and finding common ground. Army officers discussed crowd control techniques with SWAT team members, each learning from the other's experience. Lieutenant Martinez, now the program's police liaison, worked closely with Torres to track the initiative's impact. "Response times are improving," she reported during their weekly meeting. "But more importantly, complaint rates are down. Officers are approaching situations differently." The transformation wasn't just in procedures. Collins had started a mentorship program, pairing rookie officers with military veterans. They met weekly at a local coffee shop, discussing everything from tactical decisions to community relations. The conversations often drew in curious civilians, turning simple coffee meetings into impromptu community outreach sessions. Torres's phone buzzed with a message from Maria. Their daughter Maya had decided on her career path. Inspired by recent events, she'd chosen to double major in criminal justice and military science, hoping to work on improving relations between different service branches. Back in the training room, Torres and Collins introduced their newest module, Recognition and Response. The scenario placed participants in situations where snap judgments could lead to serious consequences. Officers learned military protocols for threat assessment, while service members studied police de-escalation techniques. Every uniform represents commitment to service, Torres explained, standing before the gathered group. But it's what's under the uniform that matters most. We're not just training procedures here, we're building understanding. The initiative caught attention nationwide. Police departments from Seattle to Miami requested program materials. Military bases incorporated the training into their standard protocols. The Pentagon approved funding for a national rollout, recognizing its potential to improve civilian-military cooperation. Collins found himself traveling to other precincts, sharing his story. It's not about admitting mistakes, he told a group in Boston. It's about growing from them. General Torres showed me that leadership means being strong enough to learn, especially when it's difficult. The program's success showed in subtle ways. Officers began arriving early to work, eager to participate in morning briefings that now included input from military liaisons. Service members volunteered for community outreach programs, breaking down barriers between bases and local communities. At day's end, Torres and Collins stood in the parking lot of the training facility. The setting sun reminded them both of that pivotal evening, but now the memory carried different meaning. "You know, sir," Collins said, watching trainees leave for the day, "when I first got called to your driveway, I thought I was protecting my community. Now I understand. Real protection comes from building bridges, not walls." Torres nodded, noting how Collins now carried himself with the same quiet confidence he tried to instill. "The best leaders," he replied, "are those who turn moments of tension into opportunities for growth. You've done that, Ryan. We all have." 1 year to the day after the driveway incident, General Torres' front lawn had transformed into a gathering space for an unusual celebration. His restored Mustang sat prominently in the driveway, now a symbol of the change that had started here. Tables dotted the expansive yard where police officers, military personnel, and neighbors mingled freely. Officer Ryan Collins, recently promoted to sergeant, helped Torres set up the final details for the commemoration. His new sergeant's stripes caught the sunlight as he arranged photos on a display board, images showing the bridge initiative's impact across the country. "Hard to believe it started right here," Collins said, adjusting a picture showing him and Torres speaking at the National Police Academy. Below it sat a framed copy of their training program, now implemented in 300 cities nationwide. Maria Torres moved through the crowd with practiced ease, introducing neighbors to visiting military officials. Maya, home from college, where she led the Criminal Justice Student Association, engaged in animated discussion with a group of rookie officers about her thesis on community-based policing. Lieutenant Martinez, now Captain Martinez, arrived with her entire precinct. They'd brought a surprise, a plaque commemorating the spot where understanding had prevailed over assumption. For the driveway that became a bridge, the inscription read, "You know," Torres addressed the gathered crowd, standing beside his Mustang. "Someone recently asked me if I ever felt angry about that night. The truth is, I saw something more important than anger. I saw an opportunity." Sergeant Collins saw it too, though perhaps a bit later. Warm laughter rippled through the audience. Collins stepped forward, his confidence now matching his capability. "The general taught me that leadership isn't about being right, it's about doing right. Every day, I pass this driveway on my patrol. It reminds me to ask questions before making decisions." The celebration had drawn media attention, but this time, the cameras captured something different. Instead of tension, they recorded scenes of police officers teaching military personnel about community engagement, while veterans shared conflict resolution techniques with rookie cops. Elizabeth Montgomery, the Supreme Court clerk who recorded the original incident, now stood with her husband Thomas, watching their children play with officers' families on the lawn. The video she'd taken had become part of law enforcement training nationwide, but today it played silently on a screen, a reminder rather than a focus. The real success, Torres continued, isn't in the programs we've created or the protocols we've changed. It's in the conversations happening right here. He gestured to the diverse gathering. Every uniform tells a story of service. When we take time to listen to those stories, we build something powerful. The paddles, who had witnessed the original incident, now hosted monthly dinner meetings where police officers and military personnel could discuss challenges and share solutions. Their medical expertise had even led to a new training module on stress management for both services. As evening approached, Torres and Collins found themselves back in the driveway, watching the sunset paint the sky in familiar colors. The general's daughter Sophia, now applying to police academy herself, played violin for the gathered crowd. Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, the same piece from that pivotal night, but now it carried a different meaning. You know what really changed? Collins mused, looking at the gathering. It's not just about policies or procedures. It's about seeing people first, uniforms second. Torres nodded, watching a rookie officer deepen conversation with a Marine lieutenant about community outreach strategies. That's the real bridge we've built, Ryan. Not between departments or services, but between perspectives. As darkness fell, lights strung across the yard illuminated the continuing celebration. The driveway that had once been a place of tension now served as a symbol of transformation. Children of officers and service members played together on the lawn, their parents sharing stories and building connections. "Sir," Collins said, holding up his glass in a quiet toast, to the night a traffic stop became a turning point. Torres smiled, the same calm, dignified expression that had diffused their first encounter. "No, Ryan. To the night we all learned to look beyond our assumptions and see each other's humanity. That's a lesson worth celebrating."